So in chapter 13, we were introduced to Darwin and the concept of evolution. And in chapter 14, we're going to pick up where we left off and talk about evolution in a population, and then that whole idea of variation. So the variation um, we were introduced to back in chapter 8 in the process of meiosis, and then in fertilization and sexual reproduction. All this variation is the raw material to make evolution possible. And the unit of evolution is the population, remembering that as an individual organism, you can't evolve, but a population of an organism can evolve over generations. And so this is that idea of heritable factors and descent with modification that Darwin had talked about before. So we're going to look closer into the mechanisms of evolution, how this actually happens. When we were introduced to Darwin in chapter 13, we were talking a lot about natural selection, right? That was his main mechanism. We're going to take a look at a few other things that happen that can lead to evolution. We're also going to divide up our focus in this chapter 14 between microevolution and macroevolution. So we're going to look at the mechanisms of microevolution and then the factors that influence macroevolution. Microevolution are smaller things. They happen over a shorter amount of time. A lot of the ideas that we came up with in class in chapter 13 were about microevolution, shorter time scale. We're also going to talk about macroevolution, and these are the things that result in new species. And so linking up all the chapters for this evolution unit, chapter 15 is about speciation. So this is kind of the link between what we learned in chapter 8 and then carried on with evolution in chapter 13, and then we'll finish up with chapter 15 and species. So Darwin's understanding is that populations are the unit of evolution, and we could take a look at population genetics. And so population genetics, really, we have to first start off with what a population is. So a population is an interbreeding group of individuals, the same place and at the same time. And so this idea that they're mixing the genes. So they have this total amount, this total collection of genes. That's the gene pool that they have. And we could have a small gene pool or we could have a large gene pool. We could have a lot of variation, a lot of genetic variation, and that would be a really deep pool to swim in for these populations. Or if there's like close to extinction, we might end up with a really small gene pool. So one idea that is relevant in the Kootenays is caribous, and they had a breeding pen over in the East Kootenays, and it's a very small number of individuals. So that would be a very small gene pool. Interbreeding can lead to a small gene pool or, near extinction events. The change of relative frequencies or alleles, this is how we map, this is how we count or tabulate our gene pool. The alleles, you have one allele from your mom, one allele from your dad for each genetic trait. And so we're looking at the total coding. In genetics, we call those the genotypes. And we would map the traits that are there, whether they're expressed or not. And over generations, again, this idea that we have to think bigger in time and bigger than ourselves to understand evolution, this idea of tracking alleles over time and that relative frequency is what we track in population genetics. I did put a little review down here just in case I forgot to mention it. Genetic variation really is the raw material for evolution. We could have mutations, we could have random mutations, or all the genetic variation that's built into sexual reproduction and that process of meiosis. All right, so let's get on with this. Microevolution and macroevolution. So really defining these, they were on that first slide, but microevolution is smaller changes within a species. It could change the gene pool or the genetic makeup of a population over some generations. But it doesn't make new species. And so there's a change, but no new species made. Remember, just as a reminder, individuals can't evolve, but populations evolve and over generations. Natural selection is pretty important when we talk about microevolution. We'll talk about a few others, mechanisms of microevolution, but natural selection acts on individuals and this idea of differential success. And so survival of the fittest we talked about. And so, survival, and then you have to get to reproductive age to actually make an impact on the genetic frequency in that next generation. So that's what we are talking about in chapter 13, and that survival of the fittest, that mechanism that Darwin really focused in on when he was thinking about evolution. So macroevolution are bigger changes and they make a new species. And so this is different. This is probably what we're thinking about with evolution when we talk about, evolution of humans or that sort of thing. But really what it is, it's repeated. It's a lot of microevolution or major environmental changes that can make a new species. Okay, so I thought this was useful. This is not from your textbook, but it gave some more context to the two and kind of compared microevolution and macroevolution. And so in this, it's genetic change within a species, so intraspecies. And macroevolution makes a new species, right, to compare those two. This is small scale, this is longer scale. It can be experimentally proven. We can observe this. It's observable. Macroevolution is difficult to provide experimental proof because, recreating these, it's just so long, we can't reproduce these events. And so they're difficult to prove or illustrate to people. And examples of these would be new breeds of dogs or that selective breeding, that artificial selection that resulted in a lot of crops or different looking animals. And then over here, an example would be, amphibians undergoing change to form reptiles or reptiles undergoing change to form bird. These are new species or new branches of the evolutionary tree, new branches of a cladogram. And the idea here is that this is pretty widely supported, but this is difficult to support for some folks who have alternative ideas of how the world works. So that's microevolution and macroevolution, and we're going to focus in on microevolution first and then on macroevolution. So there's three main forces, your textbook says, behind evolutionary change. Natural selection, which we've already talked about, and then we've also got two other mechanisms that we're going to explain in the next few slides. So natural selection changes the allele frequency from one generation to the next if that genetic coding increases the individual's ability to reproduce. And so again, it's from one generation to another. And as an example, going back to the blue-footed boobies, it would be a webbed-footed booby would be better at capturing fish. That idea of form and function and adaptation. So this is really a continuation of what we were introduced to in chapter 13, and really is kind of the primary idea behind evolution. Genetic drift, we could talk about how when the population gets limited, so there's a small population, it's like a subsample of the gene pool, we might get a different allele frequency. And so these could fluctuate unpredictably from one generation to the next due to chance events. So this is beyond natural selection. There's two examples here. There could be a founder effect. So that's when just a few individuals colonize a new habitat, or we could have a bottlenecked effect. So this is when there's a loss of diversity when a population is greatly reduced. And so this is going to a new place, and this is in the same place. Both of them are illustrated with this schematic from your textbook. This is the original gene pool. Look at all the allele frequencies here. And then after this founder effect or bottleneck effect, you have a much smaller gene pool over here. And you can see that the allele frequency has changed. Yours might not be in color, this one is, so you can see we've got a lot more purple and absolutely none of the orange alleles over here. So as an example here, Um, your textbook talks about the northern elephant seal is hunted to near extinction. So you get down to a very small group, and that's all we have as far as the gene pool goes. And so there's genetic and virtually no genetic diversity in there. So it can lead to evolutionary change, this microevolution. You might have a difference in that population, but it does also make those endangered species pretty vulnerable to disease because they don't have as deep a gene pool, as robust a amount of variation to protect themselves through. So gene flow is the other one. So we had genetic drift, and then genetic or gene flow. This is immigration or emigration from a population. And so, they might be intermingled, they might be kind of mixed up, but this is where, you have individuals leaving or coming into a population. So that's going to alter the gene pool. It's going to alter the population's genetic frequencies. Because it's introducing or removing some of those genetic materials. So a couple examples here just to review the mechanism. So if we had 4 moose taken from the Canadian mainland to Newfoundland, 2 males, 2 females, kind of like the breeding pen of the mountain caribou here, from that small population, there is now a large population in Newfoundland. And it says here, which mechanism would be most likely to have contributed to the genetic differences between the mainland moose and the Newfoundland moose? You take a look at this. I think it would be that one, right? This idea of a founder effect, where it's a small group making a new population. There's another one here, this time about pygmy mammoths, which sounds super cute to me, on an island off the coast of California. And so these are fossils. These are remains of pygmy mammoths. And so they speculate that this population of pygmy mammoths is descended from a population of mammoths of normal size. And then it gives a little bit of information here in this application that helps you answer the question. So it says dwarfing is common on island population and is not the result of chance events. And so in this, it says, what mechanism do you think best accounts for the decrease in size of mammoths on these islands? I think it would be natural selection. It's not chance events. They're selected. It could be a resource-based selection, right? If you were of a smaller body size, you might not need as much nutrients to survive to reproductive age, and then you're going to pass those genes on to the next generation, or the next generation will be made up of those genes that coded for a smaller size. Natural selection, just going back to that one, it really is the key idea here that often does lead to adaptive evolution. So these are not chance events. This is really how an individual interacts with its environment. It's really the only mechanism that consistently leads to adaptation. It's not chance events. So this idea of survival of the fittest, or an individual's fitness, it has to pass on and change the gene pool of the next and then the later generations. Fittest individuals are those that pass on the most genes to the next generation. They are not literally the fittest. They are not the biggest, the strongest, the fastest. They need to reproduce and change the genetic frequency, the allele frequency of the next population or of the next generation. So natural selection happens to individuals. Populations change as a result. This would be an example of natural selection leading to adaptation or adaptive evolution. And so here we can see that there is a selective pressure that's increasing the average beak size. So the individuals don't change their beak size, but the next generation or the population increased their beak size because the number of smaller beaked finches died as opposed to the larger beaked ones. So natural selection can go multiple ways. It can have a stabilizing selection, and so that favors the intermediate phenotypes or traits that are observable traits. and doesn't select for the biggest or the smallest. The example here is before C-sections, the birth weight in humans would have been under these pressures. And so a large baby, that's really hard for a mom to birth naturally. And then a small baby is vulnerable once it's born. And so now with all of our medical interventions, this selective pressure is not really as significant as it once was, but that's that idea of the average being sort of established or favored, and yeah, that idea of the mid mass being favorable. We could have directional selection, so that is like the birds that we just saw in the latest picture there, where it skews one way or the other. And so this is common during periods of environmental change, or if we have populations moving to different areas. So that idea of the beak size getting bigger, the beak size getting smaller, the extremes are supported. So disruptive selection, this is where both ends really are favored. And so this could happen in patchy habitats. So this example here is on the fur color, the observable phenotype in mice. And so here you can see the original population has this gradation of lighter to darker, and you could have stabilizing where the average is selected for. You could have directional as they move darker, or you could have both ends of the continuum being favored, the really light or the really dark. And you can imagine different habitats where those would be the preferable or the stronger trait for an individual to have, and then that population is going to change as a result. Sexual selection can also lead to phenotypic differences between males and females. And so when you have organisms that the male and the females look really different, that's called sexual dimorphism. And so there's different forms. Peacocks are really, that could come to mind. There's some organisms don't have a huge amount of sexual dimorphism. Cats don't look a whole lot different, but there's definitely some animals that you think of where males and females look a whole lot different. And this can lead to a couple other things related to or intermingled with selective pressures. So intrasexual competition, so maybe a rut that would go on in elk or something like this. So they're competing for mates. And so that's usually males competing, but not entirely. Intersexual competition or mate choice, this is where females are going to choose the flashiest, or, I've heard of bowerbirds in tropical areas, and they collect things to sort of create this like super palace for a mate. So this idea of, one sex choosing the other sex, and so that is intersexual competition. And so oftentimes there's a bit of flash here, and then that attracts the other mate. So really we need to kind of address some of these ideas of misconceptions with evolution. Is like, why wouldn't things all be perfectly engineered for their environment? And there's a few things that are going on with this. And so, selection can only act on existing variations. If you have a limited gene pool, you can't just create more things out of nothing. I guess there are mutations, but they have to happen. And then evolution works with what is present in the population. The other thing is evolution isn't limited by historical constraints. And so evolution, again, is just an editing process, right? We're not creating things from scratch. I think those two are pretty similar things. And adaptations are often compromises. They're not necessarily the best ever, but they're the best of what we've got. And so each organism must do many things. And so, feet might have to be used for swimming and walking on land. And so that idea of the blue-footed booby, they have webbed feet because it makes them better at swimming and catching their fish, but they still have to be able to walk on land and be mobile. And so again, this idea of a compromise. Chance and natural selection and how the environment changes is really the key to evolution. And so chance events affect the genetic makeup, and there's really a lot of uncertainty. So as the environment changes, this is kind of the wild card that really does impact evolution. So that's microevolution, a lot of natural selection going on in there. Macroevolution is going to make new species. And so these are the bigger things. And so the factors that influence those are plate tectonics and continental drift. And so how, at one time maybe the continents were all smacked together into one landmass and they are constantly moving around the world. Mass extinction events, and then adaptive radiation. We're going to talk about these three things when we talk about macroevolution and the making of new species. So these are really dramatic evolutionary changes, and mostly for these, we can't see them outside of the fossil record because, again, they're happening over such a large time scale that it's really hard to prove macroevolution. So plate tectonics and continental drift, this idea that they fit together like puzzle pieces. If you look at the continents, you can also track that they are still moving. There also are the biogeography. The diversity of the fossil record and dinosaurs and how things are linked because maybe they once were all connected and then have moved apart. And as they move apart, then we can see these kind of isolations. And a good example of that would be marsupials in Australia. And so this idea that the world is still changing and that changes the environmental pressures on evolution and the organisms that live on Earth. So that's plate tectonics and continental drift. The other thing are mass extinctions. So these might be volcanic eruptions. They might be asteroids hitting the Earth. Someone else in class talked about nuclear war. And so, you don't have to look too far into plots of movies or video games to find this idea that these mass extinctions can really drastically change a population and ecological communities. And so in these mass extinctions, they really open up the opportunities for new species to evolve. And so oftentimes you see a large amount. You might think back to, the change from dinosaurs ruling the earth to mammals and the mass sort of explosion of the diversity of mammals that we see in the fossil record. So extinction rates have varied. Right now, most of the species that have ever lived are gone, right? They're constantly changing. There is a question if we are in the sixth mass extinction event. Humans are definitely having an impact on the world, and this could, impact the biodiversity. So decrease biodiversity. And that could have an impact on what's next. Typically, it takes 5 to 10 million years. Again, I always struggle with the time scale on these things for really to see a big change after a mass extinction event. So hard to know if we're in one, hard to know what's going to happen next. But over the fossil record, we can look back and see that there have been some mass extinction events. And again, that opens up the opportunity for new things to exist and for evolution to happen. Adaptive radiation is what can happen when there are these new opportunities arise. And so that could have a common ancestor and really new things evolve from that. So that could be the number of marsupials in Australia. It could be the number of mammals that came after the dinosaurs. So Australian mammals or marsupials, the mammals. Or it could be on the Galapagos Island, going back to Darwin, the diversity of finches that we can see there. And so, when you kill everything off, it gives new opportunity for things to evolve. And this is really just the last image showing adaptive radiation of some kind of a common ancestor that's probably extinct now.